Hey everybody, welcome to the videos. We're lineup building for week 14 of the NFL season over on DraftKings, more so focusing on cash game roster construction. Now a couple things before I start this video. Number one, the purpose of this is not for me to build you guys a lineup to use all of your contests. You have to be able to think for yourselves and build your own lineups. I'm not even sure what this is going to look like yet. I am building it on the fly. I'm just trying to identify players that meet a certain criteria for me when it comes to cash games. They're going to see sufficient volume. They'll see an uptick in usage with the player being out of the lineup. I like their matchups. I like their price tags and things of that nature. And hopefully you can apply that same criteria to your own favorite plays and build your own lineups. And if you find this video helpful in any way possible, please leave a like. And if you're new to the channel, hit that subscribe button. It really helps me out and I really do appreciate it. And while you're at it, you might as well hit that notification bell as well so you don't miss out whenever I post new videos. And YouTube tells me around 50% of the people watching these videos have not yet subscribed. So if you're a frequent visitor of the channel or if you're just new and like what you see, consider that subscribe button because it really helps the channel grow. That's obviously going to help me out as well. And it's free, so why the heck not? And without further ado, let's get into this week's video. Alright, before we actually get into the lineup building portion of this video, I just want to say that this is a very tricky week, at least in my opinion. I'm not sure if you guys feel the same way, but I'm having a hard time trying to narrow down exactly where I want to go. There are so many good plays at each and every single position, whether they're spend up, mid-range, or cheap options. So number of different ways we can go this week, so I'm pretty interested to see where this lineup goes. But I have 3 plans for this video, and that's going to be going with a wide receiver heavy build, a spend up running back build, and then a more balanced build. We can compare the 3 and see how they stack up. But for the first build, we're going to do our spend up wide receiver. And if you guys have watched my videos for quite some time, you know I typically like to start with the running back position in cash games, which is true, but I want to 100% make sure I can get this guy in my lineup, so I can't wait after I fit in a few guys and see if he fits at the end because he's going to be the focal point of this build. And that is no other than Davante Adams at $9,300 and a fantastic matchup versus Detroit. They have a banged up secondary, and I'd have interest in Davante Adams whether he's going to be against the best secondary and best corner in football. So when you give me a bad secondary that has some injuries, yeah, you can sign me up for some Davante Adams. Probably going to get around 30, 40 fantasy points, would not surprise me in this game. He tends to go off each and every single week, and you know what you're going to get with him. Now, typically, I like to spend up more so for running backs than I do than wide receivers in cash games, but Davante Adams is kind of breaking that this year because he is just so darn consistent. And I mean, there's only a couple other running backs that are probably as consistent as Davante Adams, and even then, they're not scoring around 40 DraftKings points some weeks all the time. So, loving Davante Adams here versus Detroit, one of the worst defenses in football. They have the highest implied team total on the slate. Now, they are 9.5-point favorites, so I guess that's the only concern where they might not have to throw the ball too much in the second half or the fourth quarter. But if that happens to be the case, it's probably because Davante Adams caught a touchdown or two and more than likely had over 100 receiving yards. And that was actually the case versus San Francisco about a month or so ago, where they actually were killing San Francisco. Ended up having 173 yards, got a touchdown, and had nearly 40 DraftKings points. So it would not surprise me if we see a similar scenario there. Now, if you're looking at, for all the game log watchers, if you're looking at his week 2 matchup versus Detroit, he only scored, 6.6 fantasy points. Got to keep in mind he got hurt in that game, didn't really play much in the second half, and the Packers are winning that game by quite a bit, so they didn't really need his services. And then he missed the next month or so. So I'm going to take that game out of the equation. So he's really had a good game each and every single week besides week 6 in Tampa Bay, and that's when the Packers struggled as a whole. Aaron Rodgers did not look good in that game. They only scored 10 offensive points. So I'm going to take that out, and overall, he's just been such a consistent, amazing play all season long. That's probably going to continue here versus Detroit. And honestly, this week, I think it comes down to either if you want to spend up for Davante Adams or Derrick Henry, because you certainly have the ability to pay up for at least one of these guys. It's going to be very, very hard to spend up for 2. I'm not even going to try spending up for 2 in one of these lineups. It's just, I feel like they can both score similar points because they're both in fantastic spots as Derrick Henry gets Jacksonville. The only thing is, if one happens to bust and you have the other, you'll have a big leg up on the field, but I think they're both fantastic plays this week. But for this build, we're going to plug in Davante Adams, and then we're going to build around him. So after that, we're going to start filling in running backs. I want to make sure they're running backs that I actually want and not just filling guys. I don't want a random have to plug in a Devontae Booker, that kind of guy, because I don't feel comfortable with that at all in cash games this week. So there's a number of good cash game running backs, to be honest, this week. It's a very loaded position. We have Derrick Henry, obviously, James Robinson, Mr. Volume himself. He's also been very consistent this year in a good spot versus Tennessee. Austin Eckler, I think, is a pretty solid play versus Atlanta, although they have been stingy versus running backs this season, but his involvement in the passing game is going to make him safe pretty much each and every single week. Aaron Jones, although I view him as more of a tournament play than cash game play, it's obviously a great spot versus Detroit. They're allowing the most DraftKings points per game to the position. Just scrolling down here, Chris Carson is kind of viable in cash games, although I view him more so as a tournament play. Dave Montgomery thinks an awesome play this week at $6,500, even though the price did come up quite a bit. Scrolling down here a little bit, Myles Gaskin I think is an excellent cash game play with the volume he gets at a pretty nice price point and a good matchup versus Kansas City. And then J.D. McKissic at $4,900. He is certainly viable with the involvement he has in the passing game. Don't really care what he does on the ground. Anything he does on the ground is an added bonus for me. I'm just more interested in what he does through the air. But with Antonio Gibson being out, he's certainly going to have a role on the ground as well. And that's kind of like this is like the cash game running backs. I might be forgetting someone off the top of my head, so I apologize if I am, but don't worry, we'll figure that out if I did. But anyway, let's start plugging in an RB1. So I would love to be able to fit in Derrick Henry, but that's not going to really happen because if we do that, we're talking $4,500 left per player. I still got to get a quarterback. I need some wide receiver 2s and RB2. It's just not really that viable. Now, I'm sure it could work if we go cheap at quarterback, dirt cheap at defense and tight end. I'm sure it could, but I don't feel that great about it in cash games. If you can, more power to you. That's fantastic, but for this build, I'm not going to do that. So my RB1 here, it's going to be David Montgomery. I know a lot of people are probably cringing at the idea of paying nearly $7,000 for David Montgomery, but personally, I think he's one of the best running back plays on the entire slate. This is his third great matchup in a row. He's kind of lucking out in these matchups because he's played pretty much the 3 worst defenses versus the run 3 weeks in a row. He's gotten Green Bay, Detroit, and now he gets Houston, and he's done well the past 2 weeks. And the thing is, I don't know why people don't really want to play him because the guy gets pretty much all the touches in this backfield. He's playing over 80% of the snaps. He gets targets as well. He's had 10 targets the past 2 weeks combined, and he should get around 20 total touches, if not more. And he had 28 points versus Green Bay, 27 points versus Detroit. Would not surprise me if he gets around 100 total yards in this game and finds the end zone once or twice. And if he does that, he's definitely going to be a pretty good play at $6,500. If you guys watch my final look video where it has all the matchups and everything, you'll see that Dave Montgomery's in an absolutely fantastic spot versus Houston. They're allowing 140 rushing yards per game, over a rushing touchdown, the second most DraftKings points per game allowed, only behind Detroit. I believe Green Bay might be allowing the third most, although I'm not sure if that's correct right off the top of my head. But it's another great spot for David Montgomery. I know the price did come up $1,000 and actually $1,800 or $1,700 since week 12, but look, he's trending in the right direction. He's going to get usage, and it's a great spot. And I believe it's only a 1-point spread in this game, so either way, though, he'd be involved through the air as well. So Montgomery, feel pretty good about him in my lineup. I know as gross as that sounds, but the way the slate is, I do think he's a very strong play. And I've seen, looking at some ownership projections, his ownership has really gone up throughout the week. Like, he was kind of more so mid-pack, and I was thinking at that price tag, yeah, I totally get that. But now it's looking like he may be one of the most heavily owned running backs, which is kind of crazy, but I do think he's a strong cash game play. At this point, we're looking at a cheaper RB2, so I think we could either go McKissic or we could go Myles Gaskin. If we have to drop down from Gaskin to J.D. McKissic, we can do that at the end, but as of right now, I want to plug in Myles Gaskin here. Now, I know the Miami Dolphins are 7-point underdogs, which doesn't always set up well for a running back, but in the games that Gaskin has been healthy and played, he pretty much gets all the volume, and he's involved through the air as well, so I think he'd be fine even if they are trailing. And he's been very consistent, 15, 14, 16, 20 fantasy points, and both through the air as well, like I just mentioned. Should get around 20 total touches. And the way to beat Kansas City is on the ground. They've been pretty tough versus the pass, but they're a bit of a run funnel defense as they are dead last, 32nd DVA versus the run. And if the Dolphins want to win this game and, keep their playoff hopes alive, they're going to have to keep the ball out of Patrick Mahomes' hand. And how do you do that? You just run the ball and kill that clock. And they've been playing at a pretty slow pace this season. And I can't really expect the Dolphins to rely on Tua airing it out versus the Kansas City pass defense to win this game. So it should be a heavy dosage of Gaskin on the ground. And even if they do fall behind, he should get some targets as well, which is going to boost his floor. So feel pretty good about Gaskin this week, and is one of my favorite RB plays, and only $5,600 in a pretty good spot versus Kansas City. And I feel like this is a nice trio to start with. We got David Montgomery, Gaskin, and Davante Adams. And that leaves us $4,700 left per player, which is definitely doable because we got like the key pieces to our lineup right now. Guys that are going to get the ball a lot. They're in pretty decent spots. And now we can start either going with the quarterback position, the wide receiver 2, or I guess even tight end. Now, personally, quarterback, it's kind of wide open for me. I think you can go with plenty of guys here. I'm not sure if I want to start with the quarterback position yet, but just to talk about the guys that I do have interest in, obviously Patrick Mahomes is playable. It's just I'm not sure I'm going to be able to fit an $8,100 quarterback here. But Russell Wilson, great spot versus the Jets. Not really high on Deshaun Watson, although I think he's a nice tournament play because I think his ownership is going to be pretty low because I think everyone's going to be on Aaron Rodgers for sure versus Detroit. And I'd love to be able to fit him in with Davante Adams here. It would just make sense correlation-wise. Although you can play Davante Adams by himself. You don't have to play Aaron Rodgers, but it would obviously make sense to want to play Aaron Rodgers with Davante Adams. Kyler Murray, more of a tournament play there, not really on Tom Brady, despite it being a good matchup versus Minnesota. Now, Justin Herbert, he's the guy I like a lot. Now, overall this season, he's been playing great, although last week versus New England, it was obviously his worst game of the year. Completed less than 50% of his passes, had no touchdowns, 2 picks, a 43 43 quarterback rating and only 6.36 fantasy points. Should bounce back in a big way here. He's been great all season long besides that game, around 300 passing yards per game. So if we can fit him in, I'd have no issue with that at all, although I'm not really wanting to go with the quarterback yet. We'll see where we end up. So let's start working on wide receiver 2 and wide receiver 3. And there's two guys I really like in the mid-range this week. And it's going to be the Panthers wide receivers with DJ Moore being out because he's on the COVID list. And DJ Moore, he's leaving behind around a 25% target share and a 40% market share. So you have to redistribute those numbers. And for the most part, it's a concentrated offense. If everyone's fully healthy, it's CMC, it's Anderson and DJ Moore with a bit of Curtis Samuel. But Christian McCaffrey is not going to be playing in this game, and DJ Moore is going to be out as well. So this offense is pretty much going to run through Robbie Anderson, and I almost said DJ Moore, Robbie Anderson and Curtis Samuel with Mike Davis out of the backfield as well. So I'm really liking both Panthers wide receivers here. I know the matchup versus Denver, they've been pretty tough defensively this year, but they're going to be without their two top corners in AJ Boye and Bryce Callahan. Bryce Callahan's actually been one of the highest rated corners on PFF this year. And they still have their two safeties, which have been pretty decent in coverage this season. But when you take out their two starting corners, things are definitely going to soften up a bit. And I think they're both underpriced here. I know Anderson's at $6,200, which might not seem like he's underpriced, but if you knew that DJ Moore was going to be out and Christian McCaffrey, I feel like he could be closer to $7,000. So I think he's one of the better mid-range plays this week. So we're going to plug him in. And for the most part, he's been pretty good this season. Hasn't really been getting into the end zone at all. He had a touchdown last week versus Minnesota. But besides that, he only scored one other time versus Atlanta. But Anderson's been pretty consistent this season, around a 25% target share. And I believe a 36% market share of the team's air yards. When you take DJ Moore to the equation, Robbie Anderson should see around a 30% target share, maybe even more, and he's definitely going to get a lot of air yards as well. So I definitely think he's a very solid play this week, despite Denver being a little bit tough versus wide receivers, but the circumstances have changed, like I already mentioned. And the other guy is obviously Curtis Samuel at $5,200. Just to pair up with Robbie Anderson. I know people don't like to double up a lot of times in cash games, but I think it's fine just because of the price point and the circumstances that we have with DJ Moore and Christian McCaffrey being out this week. And I would not be surprised if he sees around a 25% target share in this game. We might see him getting used out of the backfield a little bit, get a couple of rushing attempts. Not something you can really count on too much, but he can definitely do quite a few things. He's a very fast player, and I think he should be able to pay off his price point at only $5,200. And he's actually been having some solid games the past month or so. 12, which isn't great, but 21. Busted versus Tampa Bay with 4 points, and 29 points versus KC, 21 and 17. So $5,200 without DJ Moore and Christian McCaffrey. I think he's a very solid play here, and he should be able to pay off his price point. And I imagine he's going to be one of the higher owned players on the entire slate. So I think this is a good start to our first 5 players. Now at this point, I should probably get a quarterback in because I don't want to get stuck with a guy like a Drew Lock kind of guy and Andy Dalton. I would say Matt Ryan's a pretty solid play this week, and it was looking like he was going to be the chalk cheap quarterback, but with no Julio Jones, I have a very hard time trusting Matt Ryan without Julio Jones. So I would love to be able to play Aaron Rodgers. So we could try plugging him in, or we could go the Justin Herbert route. I guess if we go with Rodgers and we end up needing some more salary at the end of this video, we could just end up going with Justin Herbert. So as of right now, let's plug in Aaron Rodgers at $7,500. He's just been so good this year, really, besides that Tampa Bay game. He's just getting touchdowns every week, getting close to 300 passing yards. He's got one of the best wide receivers in football. Like, as you can see, numbers have been great all year besides that Tampa Bay game. And I guess maybe a little bit down versus that Detroit game, but they did get to a nice lead in that game. But, I mean, I would expect another solid outing from Aaron Rodgers. He's averaging close to 300 passing yards and about 3 passing touchdowns per game this year. So I know when we plug him in, we only have 3,200 left per player, but keep in mind we can use a cheap tight end and we can use a cheap defense to make this work. And we don't have to use another running back in the flex spot. Now, typically I would like to, but I think we could end up going with a cheap wide receiver, and I do have one in mind that I think we could end up going with. But as of right now, let's work on the tight end because I don't want to get stuck with an absolute bum. Now, I am going to end up having to play a bum here, but I think we can get a Logan Thomas in, who I wouldn't say is an absolute bum just because he is involved in his offense, and he's coming off a pretty good game. I don't think the guy's the worst tight end in the world. He's just not on a very exciting offense, but coming off his best game of this season last week where I believe he had, 9 catches on 9 targets, 100% catch rate in that game, close to 100 yards, and got into the end zone for the second week in a row on 24.8 fantasy points. Not saying he's going to do that again, but I think he's a decent play at $3,300. I feel like he could be a bit more expensive, and I imagine people are just going to play him because he went off last week. And that's not the reason I'm playing him. He's always been involved in the offense, so $3,300 in a position we need some value. I think he is certainly fine, although if you do need a little bit more savings, I do think Jordan Akins and Cole Kmet are certainly viable, both at $2,900. It's just, man, they are hard to trust. But Kmet was actually nicely involved the last week where he had 7 targets. He outsnapped Jimmy Graham, 37 yards, got into the end zone for 14.7 fantasy points. So if you need a couple of extra bucks, I do think Cole Kmet is certainly viable, as well as Jordan Akins. It's just, I'm having a bad relationship with Jordan Akins the past couple of weeks. So at this point, we have $3,200 remaining. Now, I want to play the Seahawks defense, but that would mean I have, what, $3,400 left in the flex spot, and I'm not really sure if I can make that work. Because I know Perriman, I want to say he's 3,800 or 3,900, and that's not going to work. So we might have to end up going with like a Cowboys or Bengals defense, which I know doesn't sound great, but both those offenses that they're facing are not that good either. So let's plug in, because the guy I'm thinking, sorry about that, the guy I'm thinking about plugging in here is Perriman, just because it sounds like Jamison Crowder might miss this game as he didn't practice on Friday. Now it's Saturday morning right now, so I'm not sure what the new status is going to be on Crowder, but we also know Denzel Mims is going to be out, so that would mean Perriman's pretty much the wide receiver 1 in this offense. He's more of a downfield threat, and Mims is leaving behind a 40% market share of the team's air yards, and Crowder's obviously a possession wide receiver, so if Perriman's going to operate as the wide receiver 1 and the best matchup you can ask for a wide receiver versus Seattle, they're allowing the most DraftKings points per game to the position. They're 13.5 point dogs on the road. Everything was set up well here for a nice Perriman game at $3,900. Certainly is viable for me. We could look at the game numbers for him, but he gets targets every single week, and if you take out Jamison Crowder and Denzel Mims, that would obviously change things up quite a bit. So should get over 5 targets in that game. So we're going to plug him at $3,900. I know we only have 2 running backs in a cash game build, although I've done that a couple times this season and it's worked out. So I don't think it's the worst thing in the world to do. Now, unfortunately, we can't fit in the Seattle Seahawks defense, which I think are the best, which is the best defense to use this week, because they're only $3,000 versus the Jets, and they're large favorites at home. So if you can get to them, that would be the preferred option. We have $2,500 left, and we can still make this work, because we can use the Cowboys or we can use the Bengals. I think those are the 2 best cheap defenses this week. This game has a low total, and both these offenses aren't that impressive. We have Andy Dalton and Brandon Allen as the quarterbacks, so nothing to be too scared of there. I would prefer the Cowboys over the Bengals just because the Cowboys still have good offensive weapons and Zeke Elliott, Amari Cooper, CeeDee Lamb, and Michael Gallup. Meanwhile, the Bengals, yeah, they've got T. Higgins there, but and Tyler Boyd, and they're okay, but something to be too concerned about. So if we plug in the Cowboys defense, I actually don't think that's the worst build in the world. So you'd have Aaron Rodgers, David Montgomery, Gaskin, Davante Adams, Anderson, Samuel, Logan Thomas, Brashad Perriman, and the Cowboys defense. If you absolutely do not want to play the Cowboys defense, I think we could probably drop Rodgers to Herbert and probably be able to fit in the Seattle Seahawks defense. So let's try plugging in Herbert here. And then we'd have $3,200 left, so you'd have $200 remaining, but you could still plug in the Seahawks there. So I actually think that's a decent build if you're spending up at the wide receiver position. So now let's move on to a spend up running back build, and we'll compare those two and see how this one ends up looking. And I think it's pretty obvious who we're going to plug in here for the spend up running back build. It's obviously Derrick Henry, $8,700. I know he busted last week versus Cleveland. Got to keep in mind, though, they fell behind 30 points in that game, and when the Titans fall behind, it's not that good for Derrick Henry because he's just not involved in the passing game. Less than 2 targets per game this year, only a 7.5% target share. Meanwhile, guys like Dalvin Cook, Alvin Kamara, Aaron Jones, they're involved in the passing game, so they're kind of game script proof. That's the only downside with Derrick Henry. It's why I have a hard time sometimes rostering him, just because if GameScript doesn't go his way, there's chances he can get phased out and he's going to get 15 carries for 60 yards and not find the end zone like he did last week versus the Browns. And I know earlier this season, all the way back to, I believe it was, week 2 versus Jacksonville, he did bust at very high ownership, 8.4 points, 84 rushing yards, and that was it. He did nothing through the air, did not find the end zone. Now, funny enough, the next 3 weeks he found the end zone twice in those games and had pretty solid games, but I expect him to have a pretty good game here versus Jacksonville. They're one of the worst defenses in football this year, whether it be through the air or versus the run. They're allowing nearly the most DraftKings points per game to the position. I believe they're bottom 5 versus that, and overall, it's not a very good defense. They have a team total close to 30 this week, and they're 7-point favorites. So everything says it should be a pretty good Derrick Henry week, so if you want to build around him, I have no issues with that at all. I think he's a fantastic play, one of the best plays on the slate. I will say, though, it's very hard picking between Derrick Henry or Davante Adams this week. It's just on a PPR slate like DraftKings, I feel like Adams has a bit more upside and a higher ceiling, so that's why I'm kind of leaning his way. And I feel like we have some pretty good mid-range and cheap running backs this week, but again, no issues at all with Derrick Henry. And as for the RB2 position, and I guess I'm going to try to go with 3 running backs in this build just because I want to make 2 with only having 2 running backs. It is a bit of a risky strategy. So let's just plug in David Montgomery. I already talked about him, so I'm not going to waste your time saying everything over again about David Montgomery, but I do like him quite a bit this week. And then in the flex spot, I would say it's probably between J.D. McKissic and Myles Gaskin at the RB3 position. Now, I know some people probably like Duke Johnson with David Johnson being out, but Versus the Bears, I honestly just can't trust it. I've been burned by Duke quite a few times this year, and I'm not sure if I really want to go back there. So $5,600, we're going to plug in Gaskin, and we have 3 running backs here that can all see over 20 total touches. They're in decent spots. Derrick Henry gets the Jacksonville Jaguars defense. Montgomery gets Houston. Now, Kansas City Chiefs defense is not that bad, but versus the run, they are much worse. So it's technically a good spot for Gaskin, and the volume's going to be there for him. And I think that's a decent start to the build. We have $4,800 left per player. Got to keep in mind, though, we have a cheap tight end we can use and a cheap defense. As for the wide receivers, it's going to be more of a mid-range approach for them just because we're not going to be able to fit in Davante Adams here. Because if we did, that means we would have $3,900 left per player, and we still have to play a quarterback. So that's probably not the best way to go about it. So let's stick to the mid-range here. And let's just plug in the 2 Panthers wide receivers again. I just think they're in such a good spot with DJ Moore being out and Christian McCaffrey out of the offense as well. And I'm not saying like Christian McCaffrey being out of the offense is something new. It's just an added bonus that he's not going to be out, because if he was in, obviously he would demand probably close to 10 targets and over 20 carries in that game. So when you take that out of the equation, it just makes things a bit easier and more condensed in this offense. So let's plug in Robbie Anderson and let's plug in Curtis Samuel at their respective price tags. Almost clicked Sterling Shepard. Don't really want to do that. So now we have Henry, Montgomery, Anderson, Samuel, and Gaskin, all I think pretty solid plays this week. And we still have $4,400 left per player. Now we could either go quarterback here or we could go with the wide receiver position. I'd love to be able to fit in Aaron Rodgers again, although I have no issues at all going with Justin Herbert. And really I would say those are the 2 top cash game quarterbacks this week just because I love their matchups, and 2 guys that have been pretty consistent this season besides maybe a game or 2. Let's plug in Aaron Rodgers, and again, same thing as last. If we have to go down to Justin Herbert once again, I have no issues with that at all. But let's plug in Rodgers, and that gives us $3,400 left per player, but that's fine because I know we can go cheap at the wide receiver 3 position, tight end, and defense. So I think we can probably keep it somewhat similar to the last build. So we'll plug in Breshad Perriman again. Hopefully the only real difference here is that we have Henry over Adams, and it might just end up being a pivot or 2. So let's plug in Perriman. Even if Jamison Crowder does play, I still think Perriman's viable. It just wouldn't be as much of an amazing play if Crowder happens to be in. But Denzel Mims, a deep threat, 40% market share this season. That's kind of what Perriman does. So even then, I think it's fine just him replacing that. Now we have $3,200 left per player. And I believe if we throw in Logan Thomas, he's $3,300, so we'd have $100 left, which we could fit in the Seattle defense. So let's end up plugging in Logan Thomas once again at $3,300. Then we'd have $3,100 left, and that would mean that we have enough money for the Seahawks defense. Although, I will say, the Titans defense would be a good correlation with Derrick Henry, because if you want the Titans to be winning that game, for Derrick Henry to get around 30 carries on the ground. So I think that's a fine way to go about it as well. It's just better correlation-wise, and you don't have to use your own defense versus one of your wide receivers. But overall, I would prefer the Seahawks defense over the Titans. It just would make sense to want to use the Titans in this lineup, but see, you can use the Seahawks quite easily here, and we'd have $100 left. I don't think that's a bad build either. Rodgers, Henry, Montgomery, Anderson, Samuel, Perriman, Logan Thomas, Myles Gaskin, and the Seahawks defense. If you want to drop from Rodgers to Justin Herbert, you could probably upgrade your tight end a little bit, but I'm not really sure if that's totally worth it. So I think that's a good build as well. And for the last one, we'll do more of a more of a balanced approach, and I guess we'll see how that one compares to the other ones. Alright, so for this build, we're probably looking at more of a mid-range build just because we're not spending all the way up for Davante Adams or Derrick Henry, so I feel like we can fit in a lot of nice mid-range plays here. And what I've noticed is I haven't been able to fit in a lot of Chargers players, and I love them all this week. The Justin Herbert, Austin Eckler, and Keenan Allen trio is, I would, in my opinion, one of the best stacks in the entire week. So I guess for this, why don't we just play all 3? I know that might feel a little bit more GPP-ish than cash games, but I feel like they're too cheap. This game could easily surpass its 48.5 or 49.5 point over-under. I think it did drop a point when Julio Jones got ruled out, but with those defenses are not that good, and I could see it being a shootout. It's a close spread, and I feel like Vegas might be a little bit too low on that game. So let's just play all 3. It's kind of a condensed offense. Obviously, more people are going to touch the ball outside of Austin Eckler and Keenan Allen, but for the most part, those are the guys you want to pair with Justin Herbert. Now, I know some people don't want to play running back in addition to their quarterback, but when your running back is someone like Alvin Kamara and Drew Brees with the quarterback and Austin Eckler, they both get so involved in the passing game that it's a fine correlation play to play them with their quarterback. So I already went over the numbers for Justin Herbert, but Atlanta is dead last, allowing the most points per game to the quarterback position and around 300 passing yards per game. And then we'll plug in Austin Eckler, and like I said, he's just so involved in the passing game. And 3 games, or I guess or 4 games with Justin Herbert as quarterback. So the last 2 weeks, he's had 9 targets and 16 targets. Week 3 versus Carolina, he had 11 targets. Got hurt versus Tampa Bay, so you can't really count that game. And only 4 targets versus Kansas City, but overall, I think he still should be a solid play here. Would not be surprised if he gets over double-digit targets in this game versus Atlanta. They've been pretty tough on the ground versus running backs, but I still think they're beatable through the air with the running back position. Although they've kind of gotten a little bit tougher on that this year, but the past couple of seasons they have really struggled versus that. But obviously things can change. But after $7,000, I do think he's a very strong mid-range running back this week. And then we're just going to plug in Keenan Allen, one of the safest wide receivers to roster all season long. Not quite up there with Davante Adams, but the volume's there every single week. I know he hasn't been amazing the past 2 weeks, 9.8 points and 16 points, but for the most part, he's been so consistent this year. Justin Herbert looks his way early and often. Now, Austin Eckler being back can obviously hurt Keenan a little bit in the target department. Not saying he's lacking really by any means, 10 and 11 targets. That's still fine numbers. It just takes a little bit of production away from Keenan Allen, although I guess it could soften up the defense a bit from having just to fully stop Keenan Allen. Now you got to worry about Austin Eckler as well. But I really do like this trio this week. Atlanta is allowing the second most points per game to the wide receiver position. So we got 3 Chargers here, which does feel a little bit tournamenty, but I definitely think it can work here. Now after that, we could either start working on our RB2 or we could just start knocking down wide receivers. But let's just go on to the RB position here. Now, instead of using David Montgomery in each and every single build, I just want to get a little bit different here. So I think we could split it up a little bit for either James Robinson or Aaron Jones. I would say Robinson's the safer bet for volume, but Aaron Jones is on the much better offense. They have a higher team total. Detroit is dead last versus running backs. Tennessee's not that good versus running backs either. James Robinson's had back-to-back games with over 20 DraftKings points. He's actually yet to score below double-digit points all season long. The volume's there. He's pretty much the only running back that touched the ball in that backfield. He's involved in the passing game as well. So even though they are dogs, they're pretty much dogs in every single game, but he still tends to put up pretty good fantasy outings. But I'm going to go with Aaron Jones here just because I'm not going to have Aaron Rodgers in this lineup, and I'm not going to have Davante Adams, and I want a piece of that Packers offense. So since I don't have those guys, if we can fit in Aaron Jones, not saying it's an absolute must that we have to have Aaron Jones, but if we can, I would like to be able to fit him in here. Now, last week, he kind of saved his game having that 77-yard touchdown, because if you take that out, although I know it's not fair to take out an 80-yard touchdown, but if you did, just saying you did, he did not have that great of a fantasy day, but it did happen, so you have to count it. And he has plenty of upside. He's also involved in the passing game as well. I just hate that he is splitting touches with Jamal Williams, although they were in Aaron Jones' favor by a lot last week, but still, Jamal Williams is not going to not be involved, so that's always a threat for Aaron Jones. And there's always some drives where Aaron Jones is not out there, and as a fantasy owner, you're just absolutely internally screaming or just screaming at the TV, but it's a great spot versus Detroit. They're dead last versus running backs this year, so if we can fit them in, great. If not, we can adjust. If it comes to like $100, $200, we could just always drop down to James Robinson. I don't think it's that big of a deal. And since we have Keenan Allen, not that that really changes anything here, I'd like to be able to fit in Robbie Anderson, although I'm not sure if we're able to fit him in, because if we do play him, because he's not the cheapest guy in the world. He's a fine mid-range play, but he's not the absolute cheapest. That's only $3,600 remaining, which I guess we could make it work, but I'm not sure if I really want to go that route. So I want one of the Panthers wide receivers. So let's just plug in Curtis Samuel. I've already talked about him plenty, so I don't really have to go into that. And then 3,900 left, we can play Perriman just to lock up the 3 wide receiver spots. I'm a big fan of Perriman this week, especially if Jamison Crowder happens to be out. The Jets have to move the ball at least somehow. They're not going to get... Well, I guess they could get blanked, but Seattle's pass defense is just not good. I mean, the ball's got to go somewhere, so $300, Perriman definitely stands out as a pretty good value. Although, as long as Crowder is out, you could look at guys like Braxton Berrios, who's like the bare minimum of $3,000. He would be viable, although I'm not sure if I'd really trust it in cash games. I think Perriman might be the lowest I go in cash games for the Jets wide receivers. As for the tight end, we can just keep plugging in Logan Thomas. I know it's not the most exciting play in the world, but he's cheap, and I think it's where a lot of people are going to go, and I'm not trying to get too crazy in cash games. I'm trying to find guys that are decently chalky. I'm not trying to take down a cash game and get first place, because if I finish in 500th or first, I'll get the same amount of money, so it doesn't really matter to me. So we have $4,200 left per player. If I can fit in Seattle, I would like to do that, because they're $3,000. It's a great spot versus the Jets. And then we'd have $5,500 left, which I think we just miss out on Dave Montgomery if we happen to go this way. So we'd be stuck with like an Antonio Brown. Jamison Crowder is questionable, although he didn't practice. I would not be surprised if he does not play. I would like to just be able to fit in Myles Gaskin, and if it really comes down to that, I would not mind dropping from Aaron Jones just to get in Myles Gaskin. So James Robinson's $100 cheaper. We plug him in, then the flex, we can get Myles Gaskin. and actually I think that's a decently solid build. So we'd have Justin Herbert, Austin Eckler, James Robinson, Keenan Allen, Curtis Samuel, Perriman, Logan Thomas, Myles Gaskin, and Seahawks defense, and I think that's a fine build as well. But I hope this video was helpful, guys. If it was, make sure you leave a like, and if you're new to the channel, hit the subscribe button. It really helps me out, and I really do appreciate it. And if you want to follow me over on social media, not the links down below, that would be for my Patreon. If you do want to support the channel, links down below for that to get access to the spreadsheet. It's got a ton of information on there. It's only $10 a month. Cheat sheet, notes, projections, all that good stuff. And if you want to follow me on social media, the handle's in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. ChrisPennell16 on Twitter, CPen16 over on IG. I'll have my core plays video posted later on this evening. And with that being said, I'll see you guys in the next video. Hope you guys enjoy the rest of your weekend.